What makes the relationship between New York and New Jersey in The Sopranos so interesting is that the show never treats the two sides like equal kingdoms. On paper, both belong to the same world. Both are mafia organizations. Both have bosses, captains, soldiers, rackets, traditions, and codes. Both extort, earn, negotiate, punish, and try to hold on to power. But in practice, they are not built on the same scale, and that difference in size explains almost everything about how they speak to each other, how they threaten each other, and how they imagine each other. The New York family exists like a real empire. The New Jersey family, even with Tony Soprano at its head, exists more like a regional operation that survives by being sharp, useful, and stubborn. That gap in size is not just a background detail. It is one of the main invisible forces in the series, because it shapes Tony's pride, his insecurity, his diplomacy, his bursts of rage, and even the way other men judge him. A huge part of Tony's story is that he is a boss, but he is a boss in a world where there are bigger bosses above, around, and beyond him. He runs his own family, but he never gets to forget that New York is larger, richer, older, more politically connected, and more confident in its own importance. That difference begins with numbers. New York simply has more people. More made men, more crews, more earners, more rackets, more neighborhoods, more institutional reach, more layers between the boss and the street, and more ability to survive damage. Size in the mafia is not just about how many bodies you can put in a room. It means how much pressure you can absorb without collapsing. It means how many mistakes you can survive. It means how many people can disappear before the machine stops working. New Jersey never feels like it has that luxury. Every important death in Tony's world feels costly. Every unreliable captain matters too much. Every weak link becomes a crisis. When one major earner is lost, it is not just a sad or dramatic event. It changes the financial and political balance of the entire family. New York, by contrast, feels broader and colder. Men matter there too, but the organization itself feels more durable than any one individual. That is why New York often carries itself with the relaxed arrogance of a heavyweight. It can afford to be patient. It can afford to disrespect people. It can afford to lose one lane and make up the money somewhere else. New Jersey rarely has that comfort. This is why Tony's position is both powerful and fragile at the same time. Within New Jersey, he is the top authority. He gives orders, settles disputes, punishes disobedience, and receives tribute. But the minute New York enters the picture, Tony's status becomes more complicated. He is still a boss, but he is a smaller boss dealing with a larger organism. That changes the emotional temperature of every conversation. Tony cannot simply behave like an untouchable king, because New York can challenge him in ways that his own men cannot. It can pressure him economically, politically, and militarily. It can isolate him, humiliate him, or force him into compromise. Even when New York is being polite, the size difference is still there in the room. Tony knows it. They know he knows it. The audience knows it too. That is why the relationship between New York and Tony is never just business. It is always soaked in psychology. Tony hates being treated like a subordinate, yet he understands that he cannot act like New Jersey is truly equal in raw power. So he spends much of the series trying to solve an impossible problem. He wants the respect that belongs to a major boss, while commanding a family that does not have the size to naturally generate that respect. He wants parity in a system built on hierarchy. He wants to be spoken to like a giant while standing across from men who know they come from something larger. This is where so much tension comes from. Tony is not stupid. He knows that New Jersey is smaller. He knows they see his family as smaller. What enrages him is not the fact itself, but the way it keeps showing up in behavior, tone, and expectations. The insult is not always spoken directly. Often, it is implied. It is in the assumption that New York's interests should carry more weight. It is in the expectation that Jersey should be more flexible, more obedient, more careful. It is in the feeling that Tony must prove himself over and over again while New York can simply assume its own legitimacy. The brilliance of the show is that it never turns this into a simple underdog story. Tony is not some noble small state leader fighting against oppression. He is a predator himself. He extorts the weak, dominates his own people, and uses fear as currency. But around New York, he becomes the man on the smaller side of the table, and that changes him. It makes him defensive. It makes him perform strength more aggressively. It makes him obsess over respect. It makes him hypersensitive to any sign that New Jersey is being reduced to a minor league branch operation. When Tony hears contempt from New York, even subtle contempt, he feels it like an attack on his entire identity. He does not just hear a business disagreement. He hears a statement that he and his family are second tier. That feeling hangs over the whole series because New York and New Jersey are not merely different in size, they are different in historical gravity. New York feels ancient and institutional. It feels like it belongs to the original center of power. It has the aura of a place where rules were made, reputations were built, and serious men historically lived. New Jersey, by comparison, can feel newer, scrappier, and easier to mock. It is close enough to the center to matter, but not central enough to define the world. That is why New York's condescension hits so hard. It is not only about manpower or money, it is about cultural legitimacy within the mob universe. New York sees itself as the real thing. New Jersey, in the eyes of some of them, is what exists across the river, useful and profitable, but not quite majestic. Tony spends years trying to crush that perception without ever being able to fully erase it. This is one of the reasons the phrase about New Jersey being a glorified crew hits so hard when that sentiment emerges. The insult works because it touches the core anxiety. If New Jersey is merely a glorified crew, then Tony is not really a full equal. He is just the biggest man in a smaller outfit, someone granted a title without the full weight that title usually implies. That is the insult buried beneath many of New York's actions throughout the series. Even when they negotiate with Tony as a boss, there is often a trace of that attitude. They are dealing with him, but not necessarily revering him. They respect his usefulness, his earning power, and his ability to create headaches if pushed too far. But respect of function is not the same as respect of stature. Tony can feel the difference, and because he can feel it, he overreacts to it. The size gap also explains why Tony has to be so much more personally involved in things. In a larger family, power can be distributed more widely. The boss can operate with more buffers. He can let captains handle problems. He can distance himself from constant small fires. He can think in broader strategic terms because the institution beneath him is wide enough to handle routine chaos. Tony does not always have that option. His family is small enough that the personal flaws of a few men can destabilize the whole structure. He must constantly manage incompetence, ego, drug abuse, disloyalty, bad judgment, poor impulse control, and money problems in a relatively tight ecosystem. That makes his leadership style more intimate, more emotional, and more volatile. He knows too much about everyone because he has to. He cannot float above the system in the way the leader of a much bigger family might. He is dragged into everything, and that creates another contrast with New York. Larger organizations often appear more formal because they have enough scale to absorb personal weaknesses inside a wider machine. Smaller organizations often feel more personal because every problem echoes louder. This is exactly how New Jersey works. Tony's family runs on relationships, grievances, memories, old loyalties, family ties, and constant emotional management. New York, though far from emotionally clean, often projects a harder institutional shell. It feels less like a messy household and more like a corporation with criminal customs. That difference matters because it affects negotiation. When Tony and New York fight, Tony is often carrying the emotional weight of personalities inside Jersey that he cannot simply replace. New York, being larger, can often negotiate from a position that feels less desperate. The money side makes the imbalance even clearer. Size means more revenue streams, more unions, more construction, more gambling, more loans, more protection arrangements, more political contacts, more garbage routes, more fronts, more hidden channels. The exact shape of each racket matters less than the principle. Larger organizations create wider ecosystems of cash. Cash then creates leverage. Leverage creates patience. Patience creates confidence. That is part of why New York can press harder in disputes. It is not that every man there is smarter than Tony. Many are not. It is that the larger structure behind them makes them feel safer. If one dispute drags on, they still have weight. If one source dries up, there are others. Tony's family has strong earners at times, but it still feels like a smaller economic organism, one where the fall of a top earner can become a major strategic event. In Tony's world, a few men make too much of the machine possible. In a larger family, money is spread across more channels. That difference affects everyone's confidence. This is why Ralph, Vito, and others matter so much when they earn heavily. In New Jersey, a high earner is not just a good asset, he can be structurally important. He can become the difference between strength and weakness, between Tony looking solid and Tony looking vulnerable. In a larger family, even major earners matter, but the dependence does not feel as concentrated. Tony's world is a place where one talented, reckless, or difficult man can distort the balance of power just by the money he brings in. That is a symptom of smaller scale. It means the family cannot always afford to act purely on principle. It has to compromise with talent because it needs that talent more desperately. The size difference also explains why Tony's diplomacy is so important. If New Jersey were equal to New York in scale, Tony could afford to posture more openly and more often. He could say no without constantly calculating the cost. But because New Jersey is smaller, Tony has to live in a permanent state of strategic duality. He must project strength while avoiding full-scale confrontation. He must defend his family's dignity while not provoking a conflict he may not be able to win cleanly. He must negotiate like an equal while quietly understanding the limits of his position. That is a miserable place to lead from because it requires constant calibration. Too soft, and he looks weak to both New York and his own men. Too hard, and he risks war with a bigger family. Every major dispute becomes a balancing act between pride and survival. This is where Tony's temperament becomes both asset and liability. On one hand, his aggression is part of what keeps New Jersey from being completely dominated. Tony is not timid. He is willing to push back, to bluff, to threaten, to read weakness, and to create consequences. A softer man in his position might be slowly swallowed by New York, treated as a regional manager rather than a true boss. Tony refuses that. His anger, his instincts, and his appetite for confrontation sometimes protect his family's autonomy. But on the other hand, those same qualities make him dangerous to himself. He often experiences structural pressure as personal insult, and then responds emotionally instead of purely strategically. The smaller your family is compared to your rival, the more expensive emotional decision-making becomes. Tony does not always understand that in time. His relationships with New York figures reveal different sides of this problem. With Carmine Sr., Tony is dealing with old-world authority backed by scale and calm. Carmine rarely needs to shout because he represents something already large enough to be taken seriously. He can be subtle, distant, even dismissive because the institution behind him does much of the talking. Tony, by contrast, often has to speak with force because he cannot rely on scale alone. That is one reason Carmine can get under his skin so effectively. The old man can imply limits on Tony without dramatic gestures. He does not need to theatrically establish dominance. His standing already does that for him. Tony feels this deeply because he knows he does not possess that same automatic weight. With Johnny Sack, the dynamic is more personal and more unstable. Johnny is emotional, vain, strategic, and highly conscious of rank, but he still carries New York's broader legitimacy behind him. His dealings with Tony are full of temporary closeness, mutual use, and periodic resentment. Tony can at times feel more equal with Johnny because Johnny himself is still maneuvering for position. But even there, the larger structure of New York matters. Johnny's ambitions, his grievances, and his political calculations all come from within a house bigger than Tony's. When Tony deals with Johnny, he is not just dealing with a man. He is dealing with a powerful representative of a larger ecosystem. That is why friendship never solves the problem. Even when personal chemistry exists, the size imbalance remains. With Phil, everything becomes crueler because Phil removes much of the diplomatic softness that can temporarily hide the gap. He is more naked in his contempt, more rigid, more territorial, and more obsessed with honor in a way that turns structural difference into open humiliation. With Phil, the question is no longer quietly buried under polite arrangement. The question becomes brutal and visible. How much respect does New York actually owe New Jersey, and does Phil even believe New Jersey deserves it? Phil makes the size difference feel like destiny. He acts as though the larger family has the right to define the smaller one's place. That is why his conflict with Tony becomes so explosive. Tony can tolerate hard negotiations. What he cannot stand is being treated as fundamentally lesser. Yet the show also makes clear that size is not everything. If it were, New York would simply dominate every scene and Tony would be reduced to a permanently reactive figure. That never happens, because smaller organizations can sometimes be faster, more flexible, and more unified around one strong personality. Tony's New Jersey has weaknesses created by its size, but it also has certain advantages. Tony can move quickly, he can get direct information, he can influence people personally, he can improvise without navigating the same broad institutional inertia that a giant family might have. In some situations, New Jersey's smaller scale allows Tony to act with a clarity that larger organizations struggle to maintain. A big institution has more resources, but it also has more internal politics, more factions, more competing egos, and more layers of delay. This is why Tony remains dangerous to New York, despite the imbalance. He is not just the leader of a small family. He is the leader of a small family that is close, reactive, and willing to hit back. That makes him hard to casually bully. New York may be larger, but it is not all one mind. It contains its own rivalries, its own fragile hierarchies, its own resentments. Tony survives partly because he understands that size can create blind spots. Big families can become arrogant, they can assume compliance, they can underestimate the damage a smaller, more focused opponent can cause. Tony exploits that whenever he can. He knows that even if he cannot dominate New York, he can make certain moves too painful to ignore. Still, the long arc of the series suggests that size eventually matters more than cleverness when tensions escalate too far. You can negotiate around imbalance for years. You can mask it with diplomacy, mutual profit, and personal ties. But when trust collapses and conflict hardens, numbers and structure start to reassert themselves. The larger family can endure attrition more easily. The smaller family feels every loss more sharply. The death or disappearance of a major player in New Jersey leaves open wounds that are difficult to close. In a bigger organization, the machine may continue with less visible trauma. That does not mean large families are invincible. It means the smaller family pays more for every step of escalation. There is also something symbolic in the geography of all this. New York is right there, close enough to touch, but still larger than life. New Jersey lives beside it, profits beside it, fears it, resents it, and imitates it. Tony's entire world is shaped by that proximity. If New York were far away, the relationship might feel more abstract. But because it is so near, the size difference becomes intimate. Tony is constantly reminded of the bigger world next door. He is not some remote provincial boss unaware of the center. He can practically see it. That proximity makes the inferiority sting more. It is one thing to be small in isolation. It is another thing to be small beside something huge and constantly compared against it. That is why so many of Tony's reactions carry the energy of a man who feels the need to prove that his corner of the world is real, serious, and dangerous. He cannot stand being patronized because he has built his identity on command. He dominates his home, his crew, his businesses, and his social environment. Then New York appears and reminds him there are levels to power. Not because they can beat him in every single encounter, but because the scale behind them changes what their position means. Tony has to spend enormous emotional energy resisting the idea that he is merely local. He wants history, stature, and consequence. He wants to be feared not only in Jersey, but in the wider mafia universe. Much of his anger comes from sensing that New York never fully grants him that status. And yet, in a strange way, the smaller size of New Jersey is also what makes Tony so fascinating as a character. If he were the head of a giant empire, he might become too distant, too insulated, too abstract. The fact that he leads a smaller family forces him into constant collisions with reality. He cannot vanish into title alone. He must manage people closely. He must worry about earnings directly. He must handle humiliations himself. He must carry both the crown and the insecurity of the crown at the same time. New York's greater size does not just threaten him, it reveals him. It exposes how much of his identity depends on others recognizing his importance. It shows that his confidence is never as complete as he wants it to appear. That is why the size difference between New York and New Jersey is not just a detail about mob logistics. It is a lens for understanding Tony himself. He is a man who wants absolute authority in a world that keeps reminding him authority is relative. He is a boss who needs respect from people whose respect is harder to win because they come from something larger. He is powerful enough to rule his own domain, but not powerful enough to escape comparison. He can hurt New York, negotiate with New York, outsmart parts of New York, and profit with New York, but he can never entirely erase the fact that New York is a bigger beast. In the end, that imbalance helps explain the entire emotional rhythm of the series between those two worlds. New York approaches New Jersey with varying degrees of tolerance, greed, irritation, and contempt because it believes, on some level, that larger size gives it broader entitlement. Tony approaches New York with admiration, envy, resentment, caution, and periodic fury because he knows that their size gives them advantages he can never fully match. Every alliance is shaped by that. Every insult is sharpened by that. Every peace is temporary because that inequality never disappears. They can do business together, laugh together, and even pretend to stand on level ground, but the floor is never truly even. The real tragedy for Tony is that he spends so much of his life trying to force equality out of an unequal structure. Sometimes he succeeds in moments. Sometimes he wins concessions. Sometimes he compels New York to treat him with the seriousness he wants. But those are victories within a larger reality, not victories over it. The larger family remains larger. The deeper institution remains deeper. The wider reach remains wider. Tony can fight against the condescension, but he cannot fully remove the basis for it. That is what makes the whole relationship so tense and so human. It is not merely about crime. It is about a man trapped between the power he undeniably has and the greater power he cannot stop measuring himself against. So when we look at the size difference between New York and Tony Soprano's New Jersey, we are really looking at one of the central truths of The Sopranos. Power is never just about the title you hold. It is about the scale behind that title, the history behind it, the money under it, the bodies around it, and the confidence all of that creates. Tony is a boss, but he is a boss from a smaller world forced into constant contact with a larger one. That is why he is always fighting on two fronts at once, one external and one internal. Externally, he fights to keep New York from reducing Jersey to an afterthought. Internally, he fights the unbearable suspicion that New York may never be entirely wrong about how the world sees the difference.